Clara Dempsey is 53 years old now. She runs a 900-acre dryland operation in Dawes County, Nebraska, raises winter wheat and range cattle, and serves on the board of the Dawes County Conservation District, a position she has held for 11 years. She is not a person who says a lot in public settings. She listens more than she talks, which is something people who have known her a long time have come to recognize as the more important of the two skills. But in the spring of 2019, she stood up at a meeting of the Dawes County Commission and said something she had been waiting to say for 31 years. She said it quietly, without drama, looking at the people around the table. She said, "I told you this would happen." The room was quiet for a moment. Commissioner Dale Ferris, who had been on the commission for 6 years and who had not been alive when the original events occurred, asked her to explain. She did. It took about 12 minutes. When she was done, nobody argued with her. This is what she had to tell. Somebody had to write this one down before it got forgotten entirely. If you think stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. The meeting that started all of it happened in March of 1988 in the basement of the Dawes County Courthouse in Shadron, Nebraska. It was a Tuesday evening, the third week of the month, cold still. The kind of late winter cold in the Nebraska Panhandle that comes in through old building foundations and settles at floor level and does not move. 41 people had shown up, which was more than usual for a county commission meeting, because word had gotten around about what was going to be presented. Don Hollis, who had been the county extension agent in Dawes County for 14 years, and who had a habit of taking notes in red ink on yellow legal pads, counted heads when he arrived and wrote the number down. He still has that legal pad. He found it in a file box in his garage in 2019 and brought it to the spring commission meeting in an envelope, the way a man brings evidence he was not sure he would ever need. What was being presented that March evening was a land acquisition proposal from Meridian Agricultural Credit Corporation, a Denver-based lending institution that had been buying distressed agricultural land across the western High Plains since 1984, when the farm crisis had pushed land prices in Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado to their lowest levels in 40 years. Meridian had been active in Sioux County and Box Butte County before arriving in Dawes County, and the pattern in each place had been the same: distressed parcels, bulk acquisition, lease consolidation. They had acquired 4,980 acres in 4 contiguous sections and several partial quarters in Dawes County. Land that had gone to foreclosure between 1985 and 1987 that had belonged to 6 different farm families that sat along both sides of the upper drainage of Squaw Creek, where it came down off the Pine Ridge toward the Niobrara River Valley. The price they had paid averaged $187 dollars per acre across the acquisition. In 1980, that same ground had been valued at $420 per acre. They had bought it for less than half its pre-crisis value. Their plan, as presented that evening by a man named Richard Holst, who had driven up from Denver in a gray suit and a rental car, was to consolidate the parcels, lease the crop ground to a single large operator, lease the grazing ground on multi-year terms, and hold the asset until land values recovered. This was a reasonable business plan. Nobody in the room argued with the plan itself. What they argued about was the water. The Squaw Creek drainage in that part of Dawes County was not a simple system. Don Hollis knew it well. He had written an extension report on it in 1983, before the foreclosures started, looking at the relationship between the upland row cropping on the Pine Ridge and the sediment load in the creek, and the downstream effects on the hay meadows and stock ponds that 15 different operations depended on in the valley below. The report had not been widely read. He had given copies to the 6 county commissioners at the time, and to the Natural Resources District Board, and to the USTA office in Shadran. He did not know how many of them had read it. Clara Dempsey's father, Roy Dempsey, had read it. He had asked Dawn for a copy in the fall of 1983, when a dry summer had shown him things in the Squaw Creek Channel he had not seen before. Gravel bars where the channel had always run clear sediment fans at the mouth of every tributary draw. A slow flattening of the creek grade that suggested the system was a grading, filling in, losing capacity. Roy had been running cattle on 480 acres of valley hay ground since 1971. He knew the creek the way a man knows a piece of land he has been watching for 17 years. Roy died of cancer in January of 1987, 14 months before the Meridian meeting. He had been 51 years old. He left the farm to Clara, who was 22, and to her mother, Ellen, who had never wanted to farm, and who had moved to Rapid City by the spring of 1988 to be near her sister. Clara had stayed. She was farming the valley ground alone, running 63 Black Angus cows, putting up meadow hay in the summer with the Heston 1090 swather her father had bought used from a hay operation in Sheridan County in 1981, baling with an old New Holland 855 round baler that Roy had kept running with parts he sourced himself out of a supplier in Alliance. The equipment was old. It worked. She kept it the way her father had kept it, which was carefully and with attention to what it was telling her before it told her something louder. She had come to the March meeting because she had read Don Hollis's 1983 report herself, twice, and because she understood what the Meridian acquisition was going to do to the drainage above her farm. She was not supposed to speak. The agenda had not included a public comment period. Richard Holst was presenting. The commissioners were asking questions, and the meeting was structured as an informational session, not a hearing. She raised her hand anyway. Commissioner Phyllis Vance, who was chairing that night, looked at her and looked at Richard Holst and then said she supposed they could hear from the public for a few minutes. Clara was 22 years old. She was wearing her work coat, and her boots still had mud on them from that morning. She was the youngest person in the room by at least a decade. She had been farming alone for 14 months. The people who knew her knew she was Roy Dempsey's daughter, and that Roy had known the Squaw Creek drainage as well as anyone in the county, and that losing Roy the year before had been a real loss to the people who understood what that valley ground needed. But Roy was gone, and the person standing up now was a young woman who had been running the place alone for barely a year, and the room's feeling, Don Hollis felt it, though he would not have said it out loud, was something between polite attention and patient waiting for her to finish. She stood up and she said, as clearly as she could, what she believed was going to happen. She said the Squaw Creek drainage above her farm had been losing channel capacity for at least 5 years due to increased sediment loads from the upland crop ground. She said the 6 farm families who had been on that ground had managed it in ways that limited bare soil exposure during the high runoff months, rotating crops and maintaining grass waterways in the draws, because they had been watching the creek their whole lives and understood what happened when they didn't. She said a single large operator with a lease and no long-term stake in the drainage would have no incentive to manage it the same way. She said that if the upland ground was cropped continuously without those management practices, the sediment load in the creek would increase. The channel would continue to erode, and within 10 to 15 years the downstream hay meadows, including hers, would start to flood in rain events that had never caused flooding before. She said the stock ponds in the valley would silt in. She said the carrying capacity of the valley grassland would drop. She had a copy of Don Hollis's 1983 report in her hand. She held it up. She said the county's own extension office had documented the problem 6 years earlier. What Clara was describing, though she did not use the technical term that night because she was 22 and did not yet know it, was channel aggradation. It is what happens to a stream channel when the sediment load coming in from the watershed exceeds the stream's capacity to carry it downstream. The sediment drops out of suspension and settles on the channel bed. The bed rises. The channel gets shallower. A shallower channel has less capacity to contain a given volume of water, so flood events that the channel once handled within its banks start spilling over. Each spill deposits more sediment on the floodplain. The floodplain rises. The land that was once reliably above the floodline is now in it. This process is slow at first, and then it is not slow. It has a compounding quality, the way certain debts do, and it is almost entirely reversible at the beginning and nearly irreversible after 20 or 30 years. The 6 farm families who had been on the upland Squaw Creek ground before the foreclosures had known something about this without necessarily having words for it. They had kept grass waterways in the draws, strips of permanent vegetation that slowed runoff and filtered sediment before it reached the channel. They had not farmed into the creek banks. They had left buffer strips of native grass along the drainage because their fathers had shown them what happened when you didn't. Not because anyone told them to, because they had been watching that creek their whole lives. A single large-scale leaseholder with a 5-year lease and no long-term ownership stake had no reason to maintain any of those practices. The grass waterways were not profitable. The buffer strips were acres that weren't producing. The incentive structure pointed one direction. Richard Holst said, politely, that Meridian's agronomists had assessed the acquisition and found no significant drainage concerns. He said the land would be managed responsibly. He had no reason to believe otherwise. He was a lending officer from Denver who had been in Dawes County for 3 hours. Clara did not say this. Don Hollis thought it. 2 of the commissioners thanked her for her input. One of them, Commissioner Harlan Pruitt, who ran a seed dealership in Crawford and who died in 2007, told her afterward, in the parking lot, that he thought she had raised good points and he was going to keep an eye on things. He was a decent man, and he meant it. Don Hollis does not know whether he ever did. The acquisition went forward. Don wrote down what she had said in red ink on the yellow legal pad. He dated the entry and underlined her name. The large operator who leased the Meridian ground planted continuous corn on the upland section starting in 1989. No grass waterways in the draws, no cover crop between seasons. The creek ran brown in every wet spring from 1990 onward. Don Hollis measured the channel cross-section at 2 points on Squaw Creek in 1991, using survey stakes he had set in 1983, and found that the channel had aggraded, filled in with deposited sediment, by an average of 14 inches at his upper station and 9 inches at his lower one. He wrote it down. He sent a copy to the Natural Resources District. They acknowledged receipt. Clara's hay meadow flooded for the first time in the spring of 1994, in a rain event that brought 8 inches over 3 days. The creek had never flooded that meadow in a 8-inch rain. Not in the 17 years her father had watched it. Not in the records from the neighbors who had been there before him. She lost 40 acres of first cutting hay that year. She moved her calving operation to the high ground behind the barn. She started keeping her own channel measurements with a fiberglass rod and a hand level every April and every October. The flooding got worse in 1996. Worse again in 1998. By 2001, she was losing some portion of the hay meadow in 4 out of 5 wet springs. Her stock pond at the bottom of the valley silted to half its original capacity by 2004, which she documented by probing the sediment depth with a steel rod at 12 points across the pond and comparing the numbers to the original earthwork survey her father had commissioned in 1972. She did not stop farming. She adjusted. She sold down to 42 cows and shifted more of her operation to dryland wheat on the upland portions of her own ground. She put in a small earthen berm on the north end of the meadow in 2003 at a cost of $8,400 to redirect flood peaks away from her best hay stand. It helped some. Not enough. She wrote letters. To the Natural Resources District in 1995 and again in 1999, to the County Commission in 2000, to the Usta Farm Service Agency office in Shadron in 2002, asking whether the Meridian Operations crop insurance status could be conditioned on conservation compliance under the existing highly erodible land provisions of the Farm Bill. She received responses that were careful and not useful. The FSA letter ran to 3 paragraphs and said, in its careful way, that the operation appeared to be in compliance with its current conservation plan. She filed it. She wrote down the date she received it. She had a total of 7 letters in that file by 2011. Not one of them had produced a site visit, a compliance review, or any modification to how the upland ground was being farmed. She was not angry about this. Exactly, she had come to understand that the systems in place were not designed to respond to slow problems. They were designed to respond to acute ones, a spill, a violation, a documented event. Channel aggradation over 30 years did not fit the forms. Meridian Agricultural Credit Corporation sold the 4,980 acres in October of 2011 in a single transaction to a real estate investment trust based in Chicago for an average of $1,820 per acre, nearly 10 times what they had paid in the mid-1980s. The trust leased it to a different large operator from the Panhandle. The continuous corn continued without interruption. Don Hollis read about the sale in the Shadron newspaper and made a note of it. Don Hollis retired from the Extension Office in 2009. He had 31 years in Dawes County by then. He moved to a smaller house in Shadron and kept a file cabinet in the spare bedroom with his field notes and survey records and the yellow legal pads going back to 1974. He was 70 years old in 2019. His wife said he spent too much time in that room. He said probably. The spring of 2019 brought 4.1 inches of rain to Dawes County in 9 days in late April and early May. It was not the wettest spring on record. It was not close. But the Squaw Creek Channel, which had been a grading for 30 years, could not carry the load. It went out of its banks on May 3rd and stayed out for 11 days. 3 downstream operations lost hay ground. 2 stock ponds were damaged. A county road bridge on the lower drainage sustained structural undermining that cost $74,000, $0 to repair. The Dawes County Commission called a special session on May 22nd. Don Hollis came. He brought the envelope. He sat in the second row. Clara Dempsey sat at the back until Commissioner Ferris opened the floor to comment. She walked to the front. She stood up straight. She said, "I told you this would happen." She said it without heat, the way a person states a fact they have been carrying a long time and are finally setting down. She held up the 1983 Extension Report, the same way she had held it in 1988. 31 years earlier. She was older now. Her work coat was different. Her boots still had mud on them. Nobody argued with her. Commissioner Ferris asked her what she thought should be done. She told him, specifically, and at some length. The commission voted that session to request a watershed assessment from the Natural Resources District. The first formal assessment of the Squaw Creek system since Don Hollis's 1983 report. The assessment was completed in the fall of 2019. It confirmed channel aggradation of between 11 and 19 inches at the points Don had been measuring since 1983. It recommended a conservation easement process on the critical upland draws and a channel restoration study. It cited Don Hollis's original 1983 report in its bibliography. Don sat in the parking lot after the May meeting for a while before he drove home. He was not sure how he felt. Glad the record had come out. Tired that it had taken this long. He did not know whether the assessment would lead to anything lasting. He thought it might. He had been in extension work long enough to know that these things moved slowly, and then, sometimes, moved all at once. Clara Dempsey added 420 acres to her operation in 2021. Dryland ground to the east away from the creek, purchased at $1,340 per acre from a retiring neighbor. She planted it to winter wheat that fall with a John Deere 1590 drill she had bought used from an operation in Box Butte County 2 years earlier. She pulls it with a Case Maxim 125 that has 7,400 hours on it and that she has rebuilt in pieces. A hydraulic pump one winter, a front axle seal the next, the way her father had rebuilt equipment, one problem at a time, in the shop, with the manual open on the workbench. She is still measuring the Squaw Creek channel every April and October with the same fiberglass rod she has used since 1994 at the same stakes she drove in that first year. She has 30 years of measurements now. The Natural Resources District asked to use them in the 2019 watershed assessment. She gave them copies of everything, the same way her father had given Don Hollis copies of everything in 1983. The berm she put in 2003 is holding. Her stock pond has been partly restored by a cost-share project through the Natural Resources District, completed in the fall of 2020 at a total cost of $31,600. NOLO, of which her share was $4,740. No dollars. The pond is not back to its 1972 capacity. It may never be. But it is functional, and the cattle have water, and the meadow that flooded every other year in the 2000s has been dry in 3 of the last 4 springs. She doesn't talk much about the 31 years between the warning and the vindication. When she does, she says what her father used to say when he looked at the creek: that land keeps its own records, whether you write them down or not. That the evidence was always there. It just needed someone patient enough to keep watching. Don Hollis reads that line from the 1983 report sometimes, in the spare bedroom with a file cabinet. He wrote it himself, 42 years ago, though he has forgotten that now. He thinks it was someone else's. He's wrong about that. But he's right about most everything else.